Hello, everyone. My name is Adriana Romero-Olivares, and I am an assistant professor in New Mexico State University. I am a soil microbiologist, and in my lab, we study how soil microbes, specifically fungi, are responding and adapting to climate change, and how that consequently affects the cycling of carbon and the emission of greenhouse gases into our atmosphere. When I decided to study biology, I did it because I was fascinated by landscapes like this one, with a lot of visible plants and presumably a lot of animals. I was born and raised in the desert, so these types of landscapes were very different to what I was used to seeing on my everyday life. And back then, I thought that only these types of ecosystems, the ones with a lot of visible biodiversity, were the ones that really mattered. I know I was wrong now. But back then, I never really thought about what was beneath all that visible biodiversity. But as I moved forward in my degree, I started to learn more about the importance of soil and its very large invisible biodiversity and how essential this biodiversity is to keep ecosystems working. For example, in this image, you can see that in a relatively small piece of land, imagine this brown block is a piece of land in, say, a grassland ecosystem. And you can see that there's approximately 50 kilometers of mycelium of approximately 500 different fungal species. There's around 100 billion bacterial cells of approximately 10,000 different species. There's hundreds of species of algae. There's hundreds or even thousands of species of protozoa. And you see what I'm saying. There's a lot of invisible biodiversity in a relatively small piece of land. And in my work, as I just mentioned, I focus on fungi. So, what are soil fungi? So, soil fungi are fungi that live all of their life or part of their life in the soil. And there's a lot of soil fungi. In a single gram of soil, there can be thousands of different species of fungi. And if you're lucky, sometimes you can see them. So, for example, here you can see that in this piece of wood is colonized by a very thick mycelium. So in this picture, all of these white threads that you see right here, this is fungal mycelium. So you can see that this piece of wood is completely colonized by fungi. In this other picture in the middle, you can see the type of fungi that we typically think of when someone says the word mushroom. It has this very traditional cap and it's even red, like most of the pictures that we see of mushrooms. And then in this other picture, you can see a quote unquote less traditional type of mushroom, but it's still a fungus. It's still visible to the naked eye, and we can say that it's still a mushroom. However, the great majority of fungi are microscopic their entire life cycle. Sometimes we can see them if we isolate them with microbiological techniques, like you can see here in the screen. All of these different fungi were isolated from soil deserts, and we're able to see them because we grew them in the lab in these Petri plates, as you can see here. However, there's a ton of other microbes that we have never seen because we don't know what culture conditions they need to grow. We don't know what temperatures they like. We don't know what nutrients they need. So there's a lot of microscopic fungi that we still yet don't know about. However, we've studied these unknown fungi together with this known fungi using a lot of molecular techniques. But to jump into my research topic a little bit more, the type of research that we do in my lab, as you can imagine, soil fungi, just like any other organism on Earth, they're extremely vulnerable to changes in the environment. But because they're invisible, it's really, really difficult to study them. For example, in this picture, you can see a lot of things. You can see that the right side of the picture looks in pretty bad condition compared to the left side. You can say that the plant is probably stressed on the right side because it doesn't have any leaves compared to the left side. You can see that the ground is pretty eroded on the right side compared to the left side. But what could you say about microbes? What could you say about the fungal community? You can make some assumptions based on what you see in this picture, but that's pretty much it. So there's a lot of things that us microbiologists simply cannot do with our study system because we can't see the organisms that we work with. But that doesn't mean that these organisms are not important. In fact, fungi are super important. They are mediators of biogeochemical cycles. And it's really important that we study them because of this. So, if you're wondering what is a mediator of biogeochemical cycles, this means that fungi are responsible for keeping nutrients and elements flowing in our ecosystems, specifically between land and atmosphere. For example, in this picture, I'm going to show you how fungi are mediators of the carbon cycle. So, starting with sunlight up here, this tree uses sunlight and carbon dioxide to photosynthesize and to produce biomass. And it produces biomass in the form of leaves and in the form of wood. Eventually, this biomass dies and falls onto the ground. And in the ground, it turns into organic matter. Once on the ground, it's decomposed by decomposer fungi and by other microbes, bacteria, and even some nematodes and other worms. This organic matter, a portion of it that was once leaves and wood, it it's decomposed by decomposer fungi and it's organically bound in the soil as carbon. Another portion of this biomass, the fungi use to create their own biomass. So, for example, this mushrooms that you see right here, those mushrooms were made through the process of decomposition. So, thanks to the process of decomposition, this fungi were able to acquire nutrients and were able to grow a fruiting body. And another portion of these organic matter is converted into carbon dioxide and it's released back into the atmosphere. So fungi, just like humans, they inhale oxygen and then they breathe out carbon dioxide. So just carbon dioxide is just a byproduct of their metabolism. So as fungi are growing and as they're reproducing, they're taking up oxygen and they are producing carbon dioxide and returning it to the atmosphere. And this way, this carbon dioxide can be used again in the process of photosynthesis. So if you think about it, there's different types of forms of carbon forms. There's carbon dioxide, there's organic matter, and there's soil. And the one organism that it's transforming the carbon are decomposer fungi. They transform the organic matter into CO2. And that's what I mean when I say that fungi are mediators of biogeochemical cycles, and in this example specifically of the carbon cycle. And all of this is really important because soils are not only the home of soil fungi and of other organisms, but they're also a carbon storehouse. There's around twice as much carbon stored in the soil compared to what's already available in the atmosphere. So you can see that there's much more tons of carbon in the soil in the form of soil compared to carbon in the atmosphere in the form of CO2. So because soil is a storehouse of carbon, it can also be a source of carbon dioxide. And it's for the best that the carbon stored in the soil stays there because if it's released into the atmosphere, CO2 concentrations would increase. Because in case some of you don't remember, carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. So, in a few words, if a lot of the carbon stored in the soil is released into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, the greenhouse gas effect and global warming would worsen. And all of this is really important because the molecular machinery that microbes use to decompose and to store and return carbon dioxide into the atmosphere is very, very, very sensitive to environmental change. In fact, impacts to soil fungi as a result of changes in the environment can in itself result in, for example, um, millions of dollars lost in crops. It can result, as I just mentioned, in increases of greenhouse gas emission in the atmosphere, and it could even result in the emergence of pathogens of plants and animals because environmental change can shift the microbial community, and it can benefit pathogenic microbes. So, what exactly do we research in the Romero-Olivares lab? We do a lot of different things, but mostly we are interested in looking at fungal traits. What traits do desert fungi have that allow them to withstand such harsh conditions? If you think about it, whenever we think about most people, whenever they think about fungi, whenever they think about mushrooms, they think about a forest, they think about moist conditions and cool and darkish conditions. But the reality is that fungi exist everywhere, and they are everywhere in desert ecosystems. For the longest time, people have thought that there's no fungi in the desert because conditions are very harsh. It's really hot, it's really dry. And there's this misconception that fungi don't like that. But in reality, there's a lot of fungi in the desert. And in my lab, we're trying to understand what is it about the fungi that inhabit these ecosystems that allows them to live there. We're really interested in investigating how are desert fungi changing to adapt to harsher conditions brought by global climate change. So whenever people ask me what's going to happen with fungi with um, with global climate change as things get hotter and as things get warmer, what's going to happen with them? And what I tell them is that I know for sure that fungi are going to adapt. So we should worry about global climate change because of us, because we take a really long time to adapt. But fungi adapt really quickly. They're very adaptable organisms. And I'm really interested in understanding how are fungi going to change in desert ecosystems as deserts get hotter and as they get drier? We are also looking at just generally what the soil fungal community looks like in desert ecosystems. How do they look like throughout the year? How does the fungal community look like in the monsoon season compared to the winter, for example? We're also interested in understanding, is climate change increasing the abundance of pathogens in the desert? I mentioned that impacts to global climate change can benefit pathogenic microbes, and that's something that we want to see. Is this really happening? Are dry conditions and warmer conditions benefiting pathogenic microbes in the desert? And if so, what are the consequences for public health? What should we be paying attention to in terms of threats to public health? We're also interested about what fungi inhabiting deserts, which fungi are there? I mentioned there's a lot of fungi that we don't know about yet. We want to know which types of fungi are there. Are there any species that we don't know about that have a crucial role in the functioning of desert ecosystems, for example? And as I mentioned, we're really interested in understanding how do they behave throughout the different seasons in terms of the carbon cycle. How much do they decompose in, again, the monsoon season compared to the winter, for example? We're also interested in understanding how is climate change affecting fungal communities in the desert? Are they shifting in composition? Are they changing in abundance? Again, is this benefiting pathogenic microbes? Is this benefiting fungi that provide benefits to plants? All of these things we don't know about. So studying fungi in deserts is really crucial because they've been ignored for a really long time. Again, because there was this misconception that there's no fungi in deserts. And finally, we are very interested in understanding how much fungi decompose and how much carbon dioxide they're releasing to the atmosphere in desert ecosystems. There's there's no data on how much carbon dioxide desert ecosystems release onto the atmosphere. And why is this research so important? You may be asking yourself. It's really important because it will allow us to plan for the effects of global climate change. I bet a lot of you never thought about the importance of fungi in our well being and how much we depend on them for our future on Earth. It's really important too because it allow us to know what consequences to the plant community and to crops um, may be. So, for example, if global climate change is increasing the abundance of pathogenic fungi. For example, we usually think about pathogenic fungi for humans, but there's a lot of pathogenic fungi for plants, and we eat a lot of plants, and some of the animals that we eat a lot of plants. So it's really important to understand how our research may impact the uh, pathogenic fungal community and what consequences that may bring to the plant community and more specifically to our crops. It's really important too because it allows us to better understand the process of evolution and adaptation, which allows us to understand basic questions about the tree of life. So there's a lot of very basic questions about fungi and the way they exist that we don't know about that are really important for natural history purposes. It's also important for better understanding of desert ecosystems and how they function. There's a lot of things that we don't know about desert ecosystems. They've been neglected for a really long time because they've thought that they're not as important as, say, forest ecosystems. And this has been a huge mistake. It's also really important to calculate greenhouse gas emissions coming from desert ecosystems. You may not believe this, but a lot of the projections that we rely on to know how the climate is going to be in the future, they haven't accounted for the CO2 emissions or the greenhouse gas emissions that deserts are producing. So there may be some small mistakes on those projections because we're missing data from desert ecosystems, which are very, very abundant around the world. And finally, it's really important to determine threats to public health. As I mentioned, it's really important for us to understand how global climate change is affecting the fungal community and how that consequently may affect the abundance of pathogenic microbes, how it may affect the pathogenicity of fungi, and if there's anything that we should worry about in terms of public health. And with that, I hope that you've enjoyed this introduction to the research that we do in my lab at NMSU, and that you now know a little bit more about why it is so important to study fungi and to understand fungi.